Leading up to this experience of salvation when I was 12 years old, my mother had just passed away, and I had just moved to a new city, so I didn't have my usual group of friends around me for support. And I think it's important to note that I was raised in an atheist household. So when those important conversations came up surrounding my mother's death, such as what happens after mom dies, my father, who was a wonderful man and a staunch atheist, told me that when we die, we sort of just disappear and return to nature. We become nothing. Interestingly enough, this concept of emptiness or returning to nothing is found in some branches of Buddhism. It's this idea that beyond the impermanence of natural phenomena, beyond these waves of cause and effect that we call karma, resides a sort of empty field of potential. A void, they say, which is very mysterious and intriguing. I love this idea of a void, which is also full of potential. It's very mind-boggling. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. And so that's what my father told me, essentially, that when we die, we return to the void of nature. We become nothing, and that was that. My father was not a Buddhist, and yet atheism and some branches of Buddhism have this belief in common, which is rather fortunate for me, because it meant that I didn't have a story or a narrative to cling to, which would help soothe my wounded child's ego. My mother had died, and the explanation was, well, not an explanation at all. And before you get the wrong idea, my father was a very kind and honorable man. He was an older parent. He was 45 years old when I was born. He was an accomplished musician, an academic, and a teacher. He lived by his virtues, a master of karma yoga, you might say. And I think this, too, is very significant, because we weren't just an atheist family, we were a virtuous family. There was a sense of chivalry and honor in everything that we did, almost like a knighthood. We were atheists, but we lived by this code. Do good for the sake of good, treat others the way you want to be treated, always be a peacemaker, never hold grudges, always forgive, be on good terms with all people, don't let another's actions be an excuse for your own, do the right thing because it's who you are. My father was a great lover of wisdom, particularly Greek philosophy. He lived by his ideals, and he raised us the same way. As I've gotten older, sometimes I wonder at the immense blessing it was to be raised in an atheist family. My father taught us that if something exists, there must be proof. So I knew early on that if God exists, he was to be seen face to face. So I've digressed, and let's get back to the story. In the wake of my mother's death, as I was grappling with this concept of my own mortality, my father told me that after we die, we become nothing. And it was very difficult for me at 12 years old to imagine becoming nothing, as I'm sure it is at any age. And I will say it was a little frightening. It was my first time confronting my own mortality, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it. It was both a blessing and a curse that we had recently moved 2,000 miles away from my old town, and I didn't have any new friends to distract me in my quandary. My mother's death had lit a fire in me that needed to be extinguished. I needed to make sense of what had happened to her, and I needed to integrate the loss of her and the experience of grief into my psyche somehow. But my father's atheist explanation and my family's beliefs did not allow me to have any comforting story of heaven or an afterlife. Instead, I was left chasing my tail with endless questions. I would spend my time at school sitting quietly out on the quad, observing my classmates and wondering at our fate. Could it be that someday everything would become nothing? How was that possible? How could it be that my mother, who I loved so much, was gone forever? And as importantly, what would happen to me after I died? Would I become nothing and cease to exist? How could I ever stop existing if I exist now? But I could not deny that my mother had died and she was gone. I saw no evidence of God. So then, if people die and become nothing, what about me is real? Why does any of this exist? How can it exist if it becomes nothing? I know, deep thoughts for a 12-year-old. And to clarify, I was not suicidal. I did not want to die, but I was experiencing an existential crisis and I needed resolution. So upon reflection, if my father had been Christian and if I had been raised in a church where I could speak to pastors and other adults who had faith, this experience of seeing God face to face might not have happened to me, because maybe I would have accepted that the Bible was the final word on God and there was really nothing else to find. I would have been told that my mother went to heaven and to have blind faith in Jesus, and maybe that would have satisfied me. But that was not the case living in an atheist home, where religion was not taken seriously at all, and the Bible held no authority to me. Instead, when my mother passed away, I was left with this great gaping hole of confusion. I was seeking validity of my own existence and whether anything survived after death at all. And this was closely intertwined with whether or not God existed. The two questions seemed inextricably linked. If I could find the answer to one, I would have the answer to the other. But the Bible was not enough. I needed proof. I needed evidence. If God exists, if anything eternal and perfect and true exists in this life, then show me. I want to see him. Lo and behold, without realizing it, I began to practice what the Buddhists call neti neti. And this is the practice of breaking down the ego by identifying what it is not. And it doesn't have to happen in meditation. You can do this every day, all day long, if you're brave enough. At least as brave as a 12-year-old. I will admit I was a bit obsessive. My mind had found a problem. A logical fallacy hidden within the fabric of myself, the biggest question we ask ourselves about life, and I could not have peace until I found an answer. So the question was, who am I, and what about me is real? And anytime I examined a part of myself, wondering if it would exist after death, what I found was, no, not this. Is my physical body who I am? No. Not if it dies and becomes nothing. Am I my mother's daughter? No, not if I die and become nothing. Is my creativity who I am? No, not if I die and become nothing. Am I my bloodline or my heritage? No, not if I die and become nothing. Am I my name or the color of my eyes? No. Not if I die and become nothing. Am I my interests, my talents, my possessions? What about my favorite subjects in school? No, I can't be any of these because I will die and become nothing. So I'm not this either. I'm not this and I'm not this. I could find nothing about myself that was real, nothing about myself that would survive death. For as I had seen, nothing of my mother seemed to have survived. And the longer this went on, the more hopeless I felt. I became more obsessed with finding the answer to whether or not God existed. I argued ceaselessly with friends and family over the existence of God. One day I would believe, the next day I wouldn't. I was at war with myself, and I was deeply distraught. Truly, it seemed that nothing in this world was real. It was all just becoming nothing in these waves of something into nothing. And all of this culminated into an incredible moment in my bedroom where the internal walls of myself began to crumble. I was at the tail end of 7th grade. I remember I was sitting on my bedroom floor. It was the weekend, sunny outside, about late morning. The house was empty and I was reading a book about Celtic mythology. And I specifically remember the book because in my frustration at people's lack of ability to answer my questions about God, I had taken to reading various different books about ancient belief systems some of which were more occult and mythological in nature, looking for an answer that would satisfy the terrible fire in my head. But for several weeks leading up to this point, I had been plagued by a growing sense of guilt. I remember I couldn't focus on what I was reading because I was so consumed by this inner turmoil. I was beginning to suspect that I was accountable for my own inability to know God. That maybe I was at fault. Who else could I blame but me? I needed God at any cost, but I didn't even know what that meant. Just that a burning emptiness had taken up my heart that nothing could soothe. And maybe it was my own fault. Maybe I was accountable for not being able to solve this mystery. Maybe I had some shortcoming, some fatal flaw that stood between me and God, preventing him from finding me, or me from finding him. A great wave of grief swelled through me. I remember such a feeling of desolation and hopelessness. I had never been in such a dark place. I felt this hole open up inside of me, and I fell down into it. I knew that if I hit the bottom of the hole, I would die. I would shatter and cease to exist. I felt the last shreds of myself beginning to crumble. And instead of fighting it, I plunged straight in. I let go of my pride. I surrendered. And with all of my grief and despair, I cried out from my heart of hearts, God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I need you. And in that moment, I felt struck by lightning. I felt every cell in my body change and become light. There was no physical flash, but I felt light strike me, pouring down from above and permeating my whole body. I felt my heart ignite like the sun. A great wave of love and purity swept through me, so powerful I couldn't breathe. I felt my heart exploding, my body straining to contain it. I was dissolving into love itself. Then, like a silent gong being struck, every atom in existence resonated with the words, I am. I became aware of an immense presence, a consciousness interconnecting and pervading everything around me. It was so big and so right and so perfect. It was like someone had turned the lights on in the room and I could suddenly see it clearly for the first time. Like music with no sound, everything was vibrating with this presence. I am. Everything that had been empty and strange and confusing before was suddenly illuminated in perfect clarity. There around me was God, and within me, and throughout me. And his presence was not new. I remembered him instantly, for he was myself. And all of this knowledge flooded me, and I remembered this presence more clearly than I could remember my own face. God's Spirit appeared to me as a great, vibrating consciousness of primordial light, much finer and beautiful than sunlight. And it is this light that gave birth to light, and it is this light upon which light rests. And this light was within me. It was me. Through infinite layers of existence, I felt dimensions open within me, around me, and I saw that all levels of all things were pervaded by one spirit, the truth, the love, the reality. I remember staring at my bedpost, the desk, and the wall. I remember crawling across the floor and touching my nightstand, surprised that my hand did not pass through it. That the nightstand was still solid. This presence was so powerful, so vital and pure and true, it made the physical world seem like a shadow in comparison. Like physical matter was a mere plastic facade, and this omniscient force was true reality. I remember I stood up and walked through my house into the living room, with a sense that I was walking through this vast ocean of spirit. God's presence was everywhere. I sat down on the couch and I looked outside the window, and another wave struck me as I saw the sky, the earth, the trees, and I felt this intense connection in everything. Everything was one. God's spirit pervaded everything. It was in my own heart and mind, and it was the world around me. All of us interconnected by this great love and light and life and consciousness. It says in the Quran, He is the listening in the ears and the seeing through the eyes. And this is true. I felt God within me, closer than my own heartbeat. He was my eye, and I was perceiving the eye through the eye. And I knew that God dwelled in my heart, for I could feel His presence throughout my whole body like a shining light centered on the heart, where this pure and perfect love glowed like the sun. And I knew my heart to be infinite, for it contained God Himself, and God was infinite. And I knew what infinity meant, for I too was infinite and eternal. And this goes beyond the concept of human imagination. You cannot imagine this. I remembered this love had been with me since the beginning of beginnings. Throughout vast expanses of time and space, this love had always been with me. Eternity feels like all power contained within an instant. Knowledge preserved outside of time. Without the cloudiness of memory, perceived clearly, everything was real and now. And I remembered myself. And in that, I was reborn. In the power of this light of pure consciousness, I felt my old identity fall off of me like dead skin. I felt like she had never been real, like she was never alive. This new me was life itself, and life meant unity, purity, knowledge, and truth. And I saw that God is perfect consciousness. That consciousness is not contained in the brain, but exists as a part of nature, a universal law, harmonizing and vibrating within all things, and we are submerged within consciousness like an ocean. This ocean is absolute. It is pristine. It is light. But it's not the kind of light we see with our eyes from the sun. The light from the sun can barely be called light because it is harsh and destructive. It burns us, and it only illuminates the physical world. But the light of God permeates everything, including the spirit. It is both internal and external. It is pleasing to the eyes, the spiritual eyes, because it is seen through the heart, and it illuminates everything with knowledge. This light is beauty itself, and it made all things beautiful and perfect as they were. And I saw that this light was what I belonged to, that it filled my heart and my body just as it filled the room. It was the life of my life and the soul of my soul, my creator, my source, my sustainer. This love that had been with me and was for me since the beginning of beginnings. And this is God. And God is love, but not the kind of love we experience as human beings. Human love can barely be called love because human love wounds us. God's love is pure. It is life-sustaining, impartial, the backbone of reality, the pure essence hidden within all things, the great harmonizing force of the cosmos, the song of being. And I knew the true heart of my existence was only love. I knew the root of my eye was God Himself because He showed me. And yet I perceived some sense of distance between us, like an acorn gazing up at an oak tree. And I knew that although all things are one, that somehow I existed on a plane slightly removed from this perfection. And I remember the craving in my heart as I gazed upon this pure and perfect consciousness. I must become that, I thought. even as I knew it was an impossible task, for who could be as great as God, when God was everything? How could such a little acorn hope to become such a giant oak tree? And then I heard these words pass through me, and they kind of hit me like a wave. You must try. And those were the first words he spoke to me. The command resonated through my heart, and although the words were few, the meaning was very great and imbued with knowledge and layers of information several leagues deep and far too intricate to explain in the English language. I knew so much more than I could ever put into words. I knew the purpose of my soul was to serve. By serving, we become like Him. By imitating His perfect love, I too would resonate and harmonize and grow into Him. And that is what I yearn to be, one. All things harmonizing to one. And I knew the bar by which all things were measured. It was divine love. By merging with this ocean of love, I had found the pure root of myself. And so I knew every law of the Spirit, for it was myself. And all spiritual law followed the attributes of this pure consciousness. I could see it all laid out before me plainly. We are not complete by ourselves. Only in Him do we become whole. By knowing God's presence, I had been given the keys to the hidden kingdom, and all of the knowledge of spiritual law was illuminated within my own consciousness, for I had become, by His grace, pure-hearted. We exist in blindness, stumbling through trials in our lives, only to eventually master what is, in fact, the practice of perfect harmony, which is to cease harming and injuring others, and to integrate all attributes of divine love into our being. Then we become like Him. We are to become divine love. The acorn is to grow into the oak tree. Every relationship in your life is your relationship with God, for God dwells within all people. And I sensed that I had reached the end of things, as it were. I felt like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. I had looked behind the red curtain and I had seen what there was to see, and now I knew it within myself, so I could find it anywhere, in any life, in any world. I knew that we could not be parted, for He was my I and my everything. And I wondered what I was to do next, since I felt like I had reached the pinnacle of things. For what else had I to learn? What could possibly be greater than God? And God answered my question again, without my having to ask. For God lives in our heart of hearts, and He is always in our thoughts. And He said, save them. The command moved through me in a wave, and I understood God had a great task for me, that I had been given a great treasure, and I must share it with others, that I was to gather up souls in His net of knowledge and guide them to the truth within themselves. I knew this was my purpose, my calling, and my mission. And yet, I was only 12 years old, and it seemed like a great mountain lay before me. For I could not fathom how God would help me in this work, or how I was to share this love with others, and who would believe me. Yet I was not afraid. I was very happy that God had a task for me to fulfill and work for me to do, and that I could serve Him in this way. For I had been given this great love for the world, a great love for all things sacred and true, and I deeply wanted to give this love to everyone. When I saw my father that evening, I was struck that I could see myself within him. I knew that he was me, but living in a different body at a different stage of spiritual awareness. That we had, in fact, one soul, one spirit, and one consciousness. His heart was my own, for his heart was contained within my own, for I contained God within my heart, and God is infinite. And this is a mystery that escapes me, how the heart is infinite while the body is so finite. And from that day forward, I could feel people's thoughts and intentions through my heart. And there was no longer any sort of boundary between us, as I saw that they were me and I was them, but at different stages of awareness, vibrating at these slightly different frequencies of consciousness. But we all shared the same spirit, the same self. We were all one. I remember my father noticed this new intuition over time, and as I got older, he would occasionally ask me to go to lunch with him and a business partner, and then ask me afterwards if I felt like this person was a good person to do business with. And I would advise him whether I felt like they were trustworthy or dishonest. And it was never done out of judgment. It was simply listening through the heart and seeing clearly where a person's intentions lay. Now I knew the bar by which all things were measured, and all things appeared to me to resonate at their relative stations to God's perfect spirit. In the days and weeks that followed, the vision of God's beauteous light faded from the world around me and took up home within me. Meaning, I felt His light and His spirit throughout my whole body, and His presence remained ever in my heart like a glowing sun. His knowledge remained within me, for it was my eye, and I found that I could see the truth in things like I couldn't before. I no longer wanted to cut flowers from the garden, for I knew God's spirit resided within them, and I didn't want to interrupt God's work within the flower. Knowing that God's spirit pervaded all things, I understood that worshiping a rock was the same as worshiping the statue of a saint. Giving a bowl of water to a dog was the same as giving money to a church, for God's spirit resided within both. And when I did these good things, I felt the glow of God's spirit brighten within my body, and my heart filled with love, and I was lifted. And if I was ever sad, I only had to do something kind and selfless and good, and I would feel God's joy lift me again. And in truth, I never really became sad like I had before, for the world was so full of purpose and wonder and companionship, and God's love was so joyful. I could not remain trapped by gloomy thoughts for long. When I focused on the memory of my enlightenment, I would see it all over again, and I would cry, overwhelmed by the deep love and devotion I felt for God. I was filled with intense love, a love so powerful that I would gladly sacrifice my life if called to do so, and my heart yearned to serve Him in everything that I did. I understood that this love was spiritual power. It was the will of life itself. It was all one thing: love, truth, knowledge, and life. In language, they are four things, but in God, they are one. Sometimes that love would pick me up in a wave and send me soaring so high that I started laughing and laughing. And in silence and solitude, I would sink into this deep oasis inside of myself where the presence of God glowed within my heart. I found within me the ability to sit quietly for hours, focused on that inner joy of being. Once the heart is aglow with truth, you are content to be anywhere, doing anything, for you take God with you wherever you go. And whatever you do, you are in heaven. And I felt a new power of the Spirit within my body. I channeled it into playing the piano, writing poetry, and novels. I developed a quick sense of humor, a cheerfulness, and a friendliness towards everyone. I finished writing a 400-page book by the time I was 13 and wrote dozens of piano pieces. There seemed to be no end to my creativity, and it brought me such joy to do these things with God. So my purpose in sharing these changes in my character is really not to brag, but to demonstrate how this was not a psychotic break of any kind. For through this experience came immense healing, inner peace, wholeness, compassion, confidence, talent, giftedness, detachment, inspiration, insight, and wisdom. Through it came compassion and maturity. Through this experience, I came into myself, and I witnessed the true nature of love. So this is not a psychotic break of any kind. It is something else entirely. It is nirvana. I lost interest in childhood games or toys. I stopped watching TV because there is no truth in it. I found the worship of fame and materialism to cause a great sense of dissonance within my heart, as it seemed in opposition to the truth. And as I grew older, it seemed a lot about the values of our society existed in opposition to God's truth and God's nature of perfect love. On the other hand, to everyday things, I became very easygoing and impartial, to the extent that it was difficult to feel like I had any preferences at all. God's wholeness negated everything. Nothing seemed lacking. I felt no desire for material things. I knew myself, and in that knowledge was a deep wholeness and a peace beyond measure. I had discovered within myself a holiness and a truth that was more beautiful and transcendent and incredible than anything this world could offer. I was in constant awe. Laughter came easily. Everything I did for God, with God, in God. At the very mention of spiritual things, my heart would leap, and I would talk someone's ear off, kind of like I'm talking your ear off now. It was like a fountain of knowledge would pour out of me that I couldn't contain. People would ask me where I had learned such things, as I was still very young, and I couldn't answer them because God's truth lived within me, as a glowing light. And how could I describe such a wellspring of life and knowledge that dwelled in my heart? I quickly learned that people who followed a religion, much to my initial confusion, did not seem to know God in this way, internally, from the heart, as consciousness, as the I, for they had not seen him. And so I learned that when I said God, my concept came from this pure experience, while when other people said God, their concept came from books or religious teachings. Whereas I thought of God as the root of myself, as love and unity and purity, they usually thought of God as being separate from themselves or outside of themselves. So I came to think of religious people and atheists as one and the same. For before the vision of God, everything is in darkness, and after the vision of God, everything is illuminated. After this experience, I had no need for a church, and as Jesus says, the body is the temple, and heaven dwells within you. So around people I felt lonely, but with God I was never alone. And I took comfort in reading spiritual books and seeking community over the internet. And of course, I loved everyone and blamed no one, because God lives within every person. And so to love God is to love all people. And our love must be impartial and unconditional for it to be true. We cannot love people if we only look at what they do, because people are mostly selfish and incomplete by design. And you should always expect people to do the opposite of what is good, because all goodness comes from God. And you should always expect people to fail at every task, because success is only granted by God. I mean to say that unless someone walks closely with God, or has a character of great virtue, or is very blessed, it is hard to be good. But that is no excuse not to love people. It's good to have no expectations of anyone, to help everyone as much as you can, and be delighted in even the smallest good that people do, even the smallest good. Because even the smallest good is a glimmer of God within them. So, when we can see God's Spirit within people, what that means is, I see myself in them and they in me. And I realize that we are of one heart, that their suffering is my suffering, their joy is my joy. And when we think this way, how can we not love everyone? So, in summation, this is how I experienced liberation. In the beginning, you can see how an existential crisis led to the dissolution of the ego, which led to complete and utter absolution by the grace of God. I did nothing to merit this knowledge. It was gifted to me by God's grace. I am not above anyone, and I deserve no acknowledgement, and I desire no praise. I only wish to serve and to give. Only God is perfect, and so all glory goes to Him. I deeply want everyone to have this vision, to know God within themselves, to see how we all share the same self, the same spirit. I feel like it would solve every problem and alleviate every suffering. But how can I assist in giving this knowledge to a single soul if I can't love them first as God loves them? And so by that, we must always love first. Loving is higher than teaching. You cannot teach spiritual knowledge without imparting perfect love, for it is love that teaches. I am simply a mirror reflecting back on you the knowledge that you already know within yourself. And the highest knowledge is divine love. And divine love is unity. My concept of God to this day comes from this pure experience. So when I share insights or commentaries or thoughts on this podcast, I draw much of my inspiration from this experience, which remains with me as though it happened only 5 minutes ago. It is important to understand that this knowledge does not fade, because it is the I. It is the I am. And that is called Gnosis. Even so, I still study and read a lot, and I try to defer to the great masters of the past, because for something to be true, it should be confirmed by multiple sources. So do not take my word on anything. I want you to think for yourself and riddle it out yourself. I have been handed a ring of keys, and I was told to give them to you. But take nothing at face value. Try the key in every door. Test everything I say. Hone your discernment. Pray always for guidance and listen to your heart of hearts. You will find the truth therein. Ultimately, you are the path. It is growing in you, guiding you, becoming you. And by this alone shall you ascend, and by this alone shall you attain the vision. The fact that this experience of liberation or enlightenment or salvation is universal proves that it is real. That it is not unique to me, nor does it belong solely to me, nor am I the gatekeeper to it. Anyone can know God this way, if you seek with all your heart. And I want you to find it for yourself. It's not an easy task, and there is a lot of misinformation to sift through. So with patience and a bit of grace, please allow me to shine a lantern upon the great teachings of mystic traditions and spiritual concepts we can use in our everyday lives, that we might clarify the purpose of spiritual practice and increase our joy of living. I want you to have joy in your life, pure joy every day, and certainty in your own existence, in your purpose, and freedom and knowledge of your true self. Allow me to illuminate the unity and the profundity of spiritual truth as experienced across the ages. And by that, my sincere and heartfelt prayer is that you will find your liberation. I wish for you to attain it. That alone is my reward. May God's light become your light. May this flame ignite your flame. May this vision become your vision. Let this treasure not be coveted, but be given to the world. Remember, the final freedom lies within your heart. Always turn the lantern back on you.